Almost missed the landing pad there. You know, I could always edit out these intros where I walk into the videos, but people want me to keep them in there. I don't know why. It's slightly strange. I'd like to talk about one of the lost secrets, and when you say it's a secret, you could actually find this rare article on the internet, except nobody ever learns this stuff, and nobody ever teaches this stuff anymore, so kind of find it strange. It's called Gravitational and Electromagnetic Analogy by Oliver Heaviside. Oliver Heaviside, by the way, is one of the gods of field theory, along with Tesla, Faraday, Steinmetz, Heaviside, and Heaviside included there, and Maxwell. So I'd like to do a couple demos and talk about something, because anytime I mention this, and I did a really neat one years ago, where I actually put this tube on a scale, then I have a magnet falling through it, and people will say one of two things. And this is a distinction between descriptions and explanations. When you actually, and most people of course have seen this, it's not necessitatively a demonstration of anti-gravity, but what is anti-gravity? Everything follows the right-hand rule. And then we'll talk about Heaviside's principle on gravity in his article. I'd like to read a couple passages from there and at least have you think. Because the vector of acceleration of two masses, or two mutual mass acceleration, never accelerating towards one another. They're accelerating towards a null pressure point in the ether, and I recently made a really important video about gravity. The vector of acceleration equals increasing dielectric capacitance, and of course is a move to counter space. So let me grab a little neodymium magnet here, and it's just substantially smaller than the actual size of the copper tube. And as I drop it through the copper tube, you notice how long it'll take to fall through it. And people will invariably say this because they're taught like a parrot or a Xerox machine to repeat the same nonsense. They'll actually say Lenz's law, or they'll say eddy currents. And I said, well, that's a nice description, but do you know what that means? I mean, do you know what's going on? And of course they don't. It's like, well, what do you mean by Lenz's law? I mean, 99% of them don't know the formula. And it's actually based on Faraday's law of electromotive force. Well, what do you mean by eddy currents and Lenz's law? And that's all they'll say. And I've talked about this before endlessly, years ago. I actually haven't used this as a demonstration for years. It's kind of neat. Of course, since it's not exactly substantially smaller than the copper tube, it'll actually fall through it kind of sideways. It'll very, very, very lightly scrape sometimes the inside of the wall of the copper tube. But what do we mean by eddy currents and Lenz's law? When you actually change the nature of the vector of acceleration to increasing magnetism perpendicular to the vector of acceleration, something happens. So what's going on in the induced current of the electromotive force that's actually induced in the copper? And if that were the case, instead of actually having the copper, and I thought about this many, many years ago, and this is the reason why I created these little toys. I've had to take them apart a few times because there's a watch battery inside here. I just put some more duct tape on it when I'm done, so you can see how crudely it's made. There's actually two quadrupolar magnets, a flat coil, and a watch battery, and a copper reflector. I made this one. I made three of them. The third one is in somebody else's possession. And I made this one. You see I've peeled them apart many times, and I've actually played with these endlessly. But I thought for a second, well, what if a craft were to represent the magnets? And of course, what if we were able, because everything follows the right-hand rule. I don't know if you know what the right-hand rule is of fields and forces. What if we were to replace the copper tube with an inversely proportional magnetic field such that the vector of acceleration between the craft and what it's falling towards, and in this case actually both bodies are falling towards the null pressure point between the two, but of course the Earth isn't moving, not that it's perceptible, only the craft is falling. So the magnetic induction in the field is inverse to the object which is accelerating. So we actually have increased magnetomotive force with respect to the acceleration, the vector of acceleration, which is falling to, in this case, of course, the Earth. So we're able to replace that copper tube thinking, my thinking was, in relationship to so-called anti-gravity, what if we actually increase the force to the vector of acceleration? So you're increasing the force of the vector of acceleration of the falling craft such that, whoops, and I go and drop the magnet down there and it fell, hit the the metal table and stuck to it. What if we were able to increase that? Well, understanding the right-hand rule, this means we'd actually have to create a magnetic field perpendicular to the vector of acceleration. So we actually have a magnetic field that's out here, and it's something neat that I discovered underneath the supercell. If you actually take two magnets in direct opposition to one another, where you have increasing magnetic force, like say two north poles or two south poles, you actually see something form. You'll see a dielectric portal form perpendicular to where you're actually forcing them together. So anyway, I play with these endlessly. I've made these about 5 years ago. I said I've made 3 of them. I like to scale it up. Anyway, you hold it very lightly, and you drop it like it's dropping towards the Earth. I don't care if you believe me on this. I actually contain quadrupolar magnets, which are kind of hard to find, but quadrupolar magnet is just a magnet that instead of being bisected in one direction as far as north-south or north-south, they're actually north-south, north-south. So they actually have a magnetic field in them shaped like a cross. You could do a Google search on quadrupolar magnets. You could buy them. They're not that cheap, and they're not so easy to find anymore. Anyway, so when you drop this, you actually create a magnetomotive force perpendicular to the vector of acceleration. In this case, the craft, of course, is not going to sit there and, levitate. We're only talking about watch battery power here. So you end up getting this feeling like you're resting it on the lightest possible cushion imaginable. You actually get this resistance to dropping it towards the Earth. I've played with these endlessly, and it's actually increased when the moon is directly below my feet on the other side of the Earth. So at a particular, and this happens once every few months, where directly below your feet at a specific time of the day, or usually it's a night. The night, of course, because the sun is down there also. You have the Earth below my feet, obviously, and below that we have the moon, and of course below that the sun. And then, and I didn't realize it at the time, this was about 4 years ago, and it was absolutely fascinating. I always wait for those conjunctions to come up because it's magnified by a factor of about 2 or 3 as felt. And I'm just going roughly by what it's felt. So anyway, these are those little toys that I made. So when you change the nature of the vector of acceleration to increasing magnetism perpendicular to the vector of acceleration, you're actually changing it because I lost my space here. Yeah, the vector of acceleration, you actually have increasing dielectric capacitance, and of course it is a move towards counter space. But what if you change it such that the vector of acceleration was increasing magnetic force? And the way you would do that is you'd actually create a magnetic field perpendicular to the vector of acceleration such that you have decreasing dielectric capacitance. Very, very simple, not too hard to, as I think, because Mother Nature is really simple. You don't need an enormous amount of equations as long as you understand the right-hand rule, what the magnetic field is, what dielectric permittivity is, and magnetic permeability is. You could really figure out a lot of the problems in nature. So, when you show a magnet falling through a copper tube, people say Lenz's law or eddy currents, and while this is true, descriptively accurate, it doesn't explain anything, and people don't understand anything. So, if you read like on Lenz's law on the magnet through the copper tube, so all conducting materials, including copper, create their own magnetic field when a current is passed through them, like eddy currents create as gravity pulls the magnet downwards. And gravity is not a pull or a force, it's an acceleration. Through the pipe, the magnetic field created by the eddy currents creates resistance in the magnetic field produced by the magnet. So we're talking about electromotive force, as first pointed out by Faraday. So it's not really Lenz's law. It's actually Faraday's principle of electromotive force. And this means that gravity fundamentally is both dielectric and magnetic, and specifically relational, specifically and only to electromotive force. So before relativity caught hold and all its nonsense of space-time reification, there's this neat little thing, and it's not that very long. It's called Gravitational Electromotive Analogy by Oliver Heaviside, one of the gods of field theory. And you can read it. There's some complicated math. Most of it's not that complicated, but specifically it necessitatively points out, and I'm going to read a little passage here. If moved about slowly in a dielectric field, the electric force appreciably increases the static distribution. Nevertheless, the flux energy depends upon the magnetic force as well. Important point, it may indeed be represented in another way without introducing the magnetic force, but then the formula would not be sufficiently comprehensive to suit other cases. Now, what is there analogous to the magnetic force in the gravitational case? And if it has an analog, what is there to correspond with the electrical current? Anyway, he goes on with some formulas which are not that complicated, and he ends up talking, it's only about 6 pages long, on Heaviside's article, Gravitation. But I'm mindful of the good old adage about the shoemaker. Anyway, the question of the ether in its gravitational aspect must be faced, however, and solved sooner or later. He's talking about the electromotive force of the ether as it pertains to gravity. You know, the point of the formulas in the article by Heaviside is that gravity is not an autonomous force. It has nothing to do, nor does he even say this. I don't know if you know who Oliver Heaviside was, but he's a brilliant, incredibly brilliant field theorist. And his formulas, Maxwell's equations, are not actual Maxwell's equations, they're Heaviside's. Even Dollard points that out. So he's a genius without equal as far as electrical theory. He points out, he makes no allusion to space and time having anything to do with the principle of gravity, rather the electromotive force. The thing that you call Lenz's law and eddy current, so what's happened when I drop this magnet through a copper pipe? People just parrot that nonsense because they'll hit it on the internet, or they were probably taught that in college. But everything operates off of the right-hand rule. There is no exception to the right-hand rule. So since the vector of acceleration increasing dielectric capacitance, i.e. when something is falling towards another object, two objects are mutually accelerating towards a null point in counter space, the counteraction of the principle of gravity, which is mutual mass acceleration towards a null pressure point in the ether, is to increase the magnetic field and decrease dielectric capacitance via the right-hand rule. These simple little toys, composed of, unless you count the copper reflector, composed of only 5 parts. Now, you're not going to, nothing's going to levitate off of a watch battery, okay, since these have some substantial weight to them. But you can actually feel the resistance when you lightly hold it and act like you're dropping it towards the earth. You get this very slight cushioning effect. I'd like to upscale these. I don't know where I'd get the larger quadrupolar magnets. So of course the answer to that is what about quadrupolar electromagnets, where you're actually creating a field perpendicular to the vector of acceleration on that? And that's a good answer. And if I had the time and the money, I'd actually like to upscale these. But the principle of so-called anti-gravity is not that difficult. Everything operates off of the right-hand rule, and if you understand what gravity is, and I do, and I've written many articles about gravity, and I've spoken about it endlessly, and I'm not like some sort of quack with some sort of, novel idea about gravity. People will talk about, last time I mentioned gravity, people will talk about density. Now, they weren't talking about density, they were talking about buoyancy or density. Of what? Density of what? So I said buoyancy. Of what? It's not a thing in itself. Anyway, all my thinking on field theory has been along the lines, you just stand on the shoulders of giants and you see further. That's really the simplest way to do it, but I mean, I don't have as my reference, and I've read that book by Ed Leeds-Skaldin, who created Coral Castle, and I've been to Coral Castle. I don't base anything understood about magnetism or dielectricity or field theory upon that crazy little book that guy wrote. And I've been to Coral Castle. It's not that impressive. You could attack me all you want for saying it, but it's not that impressive. 99% of the people talk about Coral Castle. Have you ever been there? No. It's like, well, you should go there. It's not that impressive. I mean, it's generally impressive, but it's not like it's the Great Pyramid of Giza or something. Not even close. I don't base anything I say upon gravity or field theory nor magnetism upon, craziness or these crazy little books written by little, fringe nuts. And that's not to say some sort of fringe nut out there would not have a brilliant, marvelous approach to field, because, that happens. Of course it happens. In Tesla's early days, he was looked upon as a nut. And so is Heaviside, actually, even though he's a brilliant genius in field theory. But I mean, these guys like Dr. Oleg Fomenko, Heaviside, Maxwell, Steinmetz, Tesla, Faraday. That if you apply the right-hand rule to gravity and understand what gravity is not a force. Two bodies are not accelerating towards one another. They're accelerating towards a null pressure point in the ether. I defined with a 10-point list what gravity actually is, and I even posted a link to the PDF document like a few days ago on what gravity actually is. I made these toys years ago based upon understanding what the right-hand rule is, and if you actually change the pressure relative to the vector of acceleration, then that means you actually change the phenomena that we call gravity. And this is undeniable, because everything is magnetomotive. Everything is magnetodielectric. When you say electromotive, we can say electromotive if we like, but electricity is not an autonomous field modality. Ultimately, everything is a conjugate reality between the magnetic and the dielectric. That is the conjugate principles of the entire universe. And I definitely understand magnetism, and I definitely understand dielectricity. By the way, I have the definitions for all of these in the list below in the description. So, if you'd like to read this along with the math, it's called Gravitational Electromagnetic Analogy by Oliver Heaviside. You could just hit that on a Google search bar, and you'll get some examples. But don't say Lenz's law. I mean, this is what happens when people go to college. You say, "What's happening when you drop a magnet through this tube?" Well, it's Lenz's law. It's eddy currents. Well, that's a kind of a cute little description, but that doesn't explain anything about what's going on. And even if it did, and it doesn't, that doesn't actually help you solve problems. Like, well, what is anti-gravity? You know, this principle of defying gravity. Is it possible? Well, of course it's possible, because everything is magnetodielectric. Well, if everything is magnetodielectric, that means the approaching vector of acceleration can be changed by changing the principle within the right-hand rule relative to the vector of acceleration of the falling object or the accelerating object towards, relative to the null pressure point, relative to another, say, you know, a stellar body, in this case being the Earth, of course. So, anti-gravity is real. The Germans were experimenting with it as early as we know, the 40s. Their anti-gravity device was called Die Glocke. One of the guys that actually worked on it, Die Glocke, which means bell in German, because the object was shaped like a giant bell. They said, well, there was these underground box conduit, because it sucked so much power. When they actually fed power to Die Glocke, there was this underground channel, and he talked about where the experimental factory was for Die Glocke. There's a neat video. A guy goes out there, and it's all torn down now, the building and everything, where this old dude said where they experimented on the anti-gravity craft in Germany, World War II Germany. Sure enough, he found, even though the building had been destroyed and is completely obliterated, he found that underground box where the power conduit was that fed Die Glocke. There it was, still till today. Interesting. Not surprising, but just interesting. So anyway, I hope you thought this video was, gave you something to think about, because thinking is the most important thing. You know, parroting garbage that you learned in college. You know, repeat after me. That's not education. That's not learning anything. It's just not. So, thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.